I'm a huge time travel nerd. Back to the Future, Tenet, Edge of Tomorrow, romantic time travel like Time Traveler's Wife, Familiar Wife, you get the picture. So, when I came across a sci-fi time traveling K-drama while browsing Netflix, I had to check it out. The first episode was interesting enough for me to keep watching, but wow. This show was really rough to sit through. There were many times I thought about giving up because I had a lot of questions, but got no answers. Not even hints. Why is there a group looking for the main leads? What do they want? Why would they send legions of armed soldiers? None of these questions would get answered until the latter half of the show, where unfortunately many people have checked out by then. I would also skim through people's comments about how confusing the plot was and how bad the action scenes were. Well, at first glance, the science in the show is definitely confusing. Most well-known modern sci-fi films will explain things pretty easily for the viewers, like a lot of Christopher Nolan's work. Dreams, space travel, entropy, a lot of scientific terms and time travel rules will be laid out, but in Sisyphus, for some reason the writers assumed we knew about the basics of time travel, like time paradoxes, but the problem with that assumption is that time travel is usually different in every story. By not establishing the limitations of time travel, I had to assume a lot of things. While watching the show, I had my laptop out for note-taking to make sure I wasn't missing anything. That's how convoluted the time travel rules were in this show, and for me, that was the only way I could watch this K-drama. Sisyphus The Myth follows the story of Han Tae-sul, genius and founder of quantum and time. His research into time machines and quantum travel have drawn the attention of powerful people who seek to take full control of the knowledge for their own desires. It's not until the resurgence of his dead older brother that he begins to take his enemies in the shadows seriously. In the near future, growing up in a post-nuclear South Korea, Kang So-hae travels back to the present with foresight to prevent a nuclear war from occurring. Now, if you're unfamiliar with how I review K-dramas, I use a Taebok token system, where I give shows a rating followed by additional tokens that will support the rating. So, should you watch Sisyphus The Myth? If you're looking for a show that has romance but a heavier focus on sci-fi, I'd say give it a shot. Otherwise, if you're expecting pure romance or pure sci-fi, both expectations will disappoint you. As lovely as our two leads are, they aren't given enough screen time together to establish their relationship. In terms of sci-fi, the rules aren't explained too well and are never answered, so you'll need a lot of speculation. And so, I'm giving Sisyphus The Myth a 7 out of 10. Why? Action scenes. The action scenes are good. They're reminiscent of modern action films, focusing on handheld movements and encompassing power. So-hae is a force not to be reckoned with. The gunplay scenes are exciting, but can sometimes feel a bit unbelievable because of how inaccurate the bad guys are, and the lack of cover for our heroes. More on this later. Production quality. There was a lot of effort placed into the production of the show. Many effects are practical when possible, but the use of CGI doesn't suspend our belief of a post-nuclear Seoul or a modern sci-fi future. The set design is inspired by post-apocalyptic works such as A Quiet Place, with precise attention to detail about the visuals you would see in such a setting. It's hard to believe I'm not watching a film. I'm American, so firearms used in our TV shows are pretty common, but firearms being widely used in South Korea can definitely raise a few eyebrows. However, the same goes for our characters and the people in this story. News reporters will talk about extremely rare shooting incidents in South Korea, and characters will even acknowledge that using guns can be overkill.
진정해 제발. 여기가 미국이야? 총 없으면 갈등 상황 해결을 못 해?
Now for the fun stuff. Incompetent bad guys. The bad guys in this show are a bit underwhelming and underpowered. They will swarm our heroes and outnumber them, but fail to capture them. I'm not downplaying So-hae's combat capabilities or Tae-sul's ingenuity, but it's frustrating to see how our heroes are only alive because the bad guys just suck. It might seem I'm being nitpicky about it, and I will admit I am, but the problem with having bad guys who can't secure a victory makes them seem unworthy of bad guys. How am I supposed to believe that the Control Bureau is a threat if they can't even capture two people with an army of trained soldiers? Literal armies will storm their hideout and won't even have the proper skills to subdue their targets. How am I supposed to believe Asia Mart is evil if they never pull the trigger on someone who doesn't give them what they want? If So-hae wasn't the badass she was, as established in the second episode, we wouldn't think she'd be capable of protecting Tae-sul. If Tae-sul wasn't the genius he was, as established in the first episode, we wouldn't think he'd be capable of creating time travel. What I'm trying to say is, even if the bad guys have done some terrible things to prove that they are bad, if they're not capable of getting their jobs done as the bad guys, it won't convince us that they're a threat. The cure to this problem is to portray the heroes as being so strategic and tactical that the enemies weren't expecting it. Case in point, in another K-drama, Vagabond, our characters are surrounded and being raided by armed soldiers. Their response? Barricade themselves, use cover. Our Sisyphus heroes? Use a grappling hook while being surrounded? Toss Coke bottles behind a refrigerator door as the only cover? Fill the room with smoke and escape only to get caught? Use EMP to black out the building only for the backup generator to kick in? See what I mean? Our heroes don't feel powerful, and it feels like the bad guys are just giving them chances to escape because the writers said it's not time yet. Slow pacing and obsession with confusing viewers. Now don't get me started about the plot. I think it had a great setup. Preventing nuclear war, people time traveling back to the present, factions trying to control the time travelers or profit from them. Okay, sweet, that's interesting. But it gets completely sidetracked when the characters start losing focus on what they need to do. The first half of the show is dedicated to running away with no clear end goal in sight. There are a lot of questions that get raised, but none of them get answered, not even a hint. And so because there are more questions than answers, many first-time viewers will stop watching the show before episode 8. What's probably the most annoying part of the show is when the characters never tell anyone about what's going on. I understand that knowing future events can mess up timelines and their existences, but leaving us in the dark with no hint or explanation is equally as bad. Mystery is supposed to allure, captivate, and intrigue our curiosity, but instead this type of mystery becomes confusing because they're so focused on dramatic set pieces and events that don't change anything to the plot or characters. For example, there's a scene where the two leads decide to go their own separate ways because they both want different things. It's a dramatic moment and could have been a huge turning point for our characters, except they come back together in the same episode 5 minutes later. Now, if there was a scene or an entire episode to help them realize that they needed each other, then it wouldn't have made their previous breakup redundant. The plot gets more screen time than the characters. The show is mainly about unraveling the mystery of time travel and who the bad guys are, which is fine. However, in the first half, all we get is plot and no character development. For example, there's a minor character who plays a pretty big role as the bad guy, but his quest for revenge was the only thing we knew about him, which unfortunately made him rather uninteresting and one-dimensional. In fact, pretty much all the characters in the first half are one-dimensional, and by that I mean the characters only have one particular mindset, one particular goal, and no particular flaws that make them conflicted about their decisions. And what is their particular mindset? Telling other people not to do things without any explanation. You will see this countless times throughout the show. Taesol will ask Sohei a question and she will not respond.
이거 뭐야? 이거 방사능 개수기? 뭐 건너오는 사람마다 다 피폭돼서 오는 거야?
Sohei will tell Taesol to do something without any persuading on her end.
그놈들이 곧 널 잡으러 갈 거야. 도망쳐야 돼. 잡히면 죽어. 네가 생각하는 것보다 훨씬 더 무서운 놈들이야. 절대 아무도 믿지 마.
Characters will demand others to do something.
일단 가요 얼른. 어디냐고? 먼저 갈 때 갔다고.
It's frustrating. I've been complaining a lot, as you've noticed. They are mainly about the first half of the show. However, the second half is better. Unfortunately, as I mentioned in the introduction to this review, every question or gripe we've had since the beginning of the show gets answered and explained in the second half. How does the war start? How is life in post-nuclear Seoul? Who's the real bad guy? What did Taesol's relationship with his brother look like? What is in Sohei's diary? Of course, answering those questions only raises more questions. That, unfortunately, like any time travel story, we will have to theorize and answer most of them ourselves. Every annoyance I had with the show was pretty much resolved in the second half of the show. For example, there's a theme of how the future is inevitable, so the reason why the bad guys could never capture our two leads is because the future says so. I know, this sounds dumb, but that's what we get. Also, like any time travel story, it's much better the second time around once you know the pieces to the puzzle. In addition, much of the characters have more depth to them because we start to see and understand their goals. There's the introduction of the main bad guy, there's the backstory to the people in charge of Asia Mart, and there's more self-doubt with characters and their decisions, which all make for a better and more interesting story. Now, even though I gave this show a 7 out of 10, to be honest, I can't find myself recommending this K-drama to the average viewer. As great as the two leads are in their roles, there are still a lot of confusing time travel rules, and I found myself having to rewind moments I've missed in character conversations. Characters are appealing and likable, but not lovable. because the show is focused on the plot instead of character development. I know a lot of people have questions about the ending and the plot holes and the inconsistencies and the rules of time travel in this show, but if you're interested in finding or discussing those answers, I have a video that will explain the entire timeline of Sisyphus The Myth. Otherwise, I'd stay away from the show. I'll see you next time.